My boyfriend told me to stop being so sensitive. He lost it when I stopped reacting entirely. Liam used to love how I reacted to everything. When we first started dating 3 years ago, he'd tell me my expressiveness was adorable. I'd gasp at plot twists in movies, tear up at commercials with puppies, laugh until I couldn't breathe at his jokes. He said my emotions made everything more vivid, like experiencing life in high definition instead of grainy black and white. He'd wrap his arms around me when I cried at sad songs and kiss my forehead when I got excited about small things like finding the perfect avocado at the grocery store. 6 months in, he proposed during a sunset hike, and I cried so hard I could barely say yes. He laughed and wiped my tears and said he never wanted me to change. But somewhere around our second anniversary, something shifted. I'd gotten a promotion at the advertising agency where I worked as a junior copywriter, and the stress came with longer hours and tighter deadlines. My creative director, Francine, was brilliant but demanding, expecting 3 concepts by Monday when it was already Friday afternoon. I'd come home exhausted and need to decompress by talking through my day. Liam would listen at first, nodding along, but his eyes would glaze over halfway through. When I'd cry from frustration about a rejected campaign or a client who couldn't articulate what they wanted, he'd sigh and say I was overthinking things. The first time he said I was being too sensitive, I was upset about a comment Francine made about my work lacking edge. He told me to toughen up because the real world didn't care about hurt feelings. I'd laughed it off, assuming he was just having a bad day. The criticism became more frequent after that. When I'd get emotional about anything, his face would tighten with irritation. I cried during a documentary about ocean pollution, and he said I was being dramatic over things I couldn't control. I got angry when a driver cut me off in traffic and honked, and he said I was overreacting to normal city driving. I expressed disappointment when he forgot our dinner reservation, and he accused me of making mountains out of molehills. Every emotional response I had was labeled as excessive, irrational, or attention-seeking. He'd roll his eyes when my voice got higher with excitement, or shake his head when tears formed during emotional conversations. The phrase, "you're too sensitive," became his default response to anything I felt deeply. I started trying to control my reactions around him. When something made me want to cry, I'd bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. When something excited me, I'd tone down my enthusiasm to a mild smile. When something frustrated me, I'd swallow the anger and speak in measured, even tones. It was exhausting, like holding my breath underwater and only coming up for air when he wasn't looking. My best friend Kendra noticed during our weekly coffee meetups that I seemed muted, like someone had turned down my volume. She asked if everything was okay with Liam, and I assured her we were fine, just adjusting to living together. The lie felt heavy in my mouth, but I didn't know how to explain that the person who'd loved my emotions now treated them like character flaws. 3 months ago, we had the fight that changed everything. I'd spent weeks working on a pitch for a major client, a sustainable fashion brand looking to rebrand their entire image. The presentation was scheduled for Wednesday morning, and I'd practiced my delivery until I could recite it in my sleep. Tuesday evening, Francine called to tell me the client had moved to a competitor agency because their CEO and our CEO had some personal falling out. All that work, all those late nights, completely wasted because of corporate drama that had nothing to do with the quality of our ideas. I came home and broke down crying on the couch, not just sad tears, but the full-body sobbing that comes from weeks of stress finally releasing. Liam walked in from the gym, saw me crying, and his expression shifted from concern to annoyance in seconds. He asked what was wrong now, emphasis on the now like my emotions were a recurring inconvenience. I explained about the client and the wasted work, and he said these things happen in business and I needed to develop thicker skin. When I said I was allowed to be upset about it, he exploded. He said I was exhausting to live with because everything was a crisis with me. He said normal people didn't fall apart over work disappointments or cry at every sad thing they encountered. He said my constant emotional reactions were draining him, and he couldn't be my therapist anymore. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last. Then he said the thing that stuck in my brain like a splinter I couldn't remove. He looked directly at me with something close to disgust and said I needed to stop being so sensitive or our relationship wouldn't survive. He said if I couldn't learn to control myself, he'd have to reconsider whether we had a future together. The threat was clear and deliberate, designed to scare me into compliance. I stared at him through blurry tears, and something inside me went quiet. Not sad quiet, but eerily calm quiet, like flipping a switch and feeling the power cut off completely. I wiped my face, stood up, and went to the bedroom without another word. He called after me asking if I heard him, and I said yes without turning around. That night, lying in bed while Liam snored beside me, I made a decision. He wanted me to stop being sensitive, to control my reactions, to be less emotional. Fine. I'd give him exactly what he asked for. Not by suppressing my feelings, but by removing him from access to them entirely. He wouldn't get my joy or my sadness, my excitement or my frustration, my love or my anger. He'd get nothing. The idea felt cold and calculated, but also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't going to argue or explain or defend my right to feel things. I was just going to stop sharing any of it with him. The next morning, I woke up and went through my routine without speaking to Liam beyond basic logistics. He asked if I was still upset about last night, and I said no in a flat, neutral tone. He looked relieved, like he'd successfully trained a dog to stop barking. I made coffee, got dressed, and left for work without the usual goodbye kiss or have a good day text. At the office, I threw myself into new projects with Francine, who noticed my increased focus and sharper concepts. When she praised my work, I felt proud, but didn't share the victory with Liam later. When a coworker made me laugh until my sides hurt, I didn't relay the story over dinner. When I had a frustrating interaction with a difficult client, I didn't mention it at all. Liam didn't notice the change immediately because the absence of my emotions looked like what he'd asked for. I came home calm and unbothered, made dinner, ate while scrolling through my phone, then worked on my laptop or read a book until bed. I responded to his questions with brief, factual answers. Yes, work was fine. No, I didn't need anything from the store. Sure, we could watch whatever he wanted on television. My voice stayed level and even, never rising with excitement or dropping with disappointment. I laughed politely at his jokes, but not with the full-body shaking laughter he used to trigger. I smiled when appropriate, but kept it small and controlled. The first week passed with Liam seeming pleased with the new dynamic. He'd come home from his job at the tech startup and talk about his day, and I'd listen without contributing much beyond nods and minimal responses. He didn't ask about my day anymore, probably relieved to avoid potential emotional reactions. We existed in the same space like roommates with a shared lease, cordial but distant. I continued pouring my actual emotions into other outlets. I'd call Kendra on my lunch breaks and tell her everything I couldn't tell Liam. I'd write long journal entries processing my feelings about work and life and the slow death of my relationship. I'd cry in my car in the parking garage before heading upstairs to our apartment. Liam never saw any of it. Around the 2-week mark, something shifted in him. We were making dinner together, a task that used to involve me dancing to music and telling stories while he chopped vegetables. This time, I methodically prepared ingredients in silence, following the recipe without commentary. He kept glancing at me like he was waiting for something. Finally, he asked if I was okay, and I said yes. He pressed further, saying I seemed distant, and I told him I was just focused on cooking. He dropped it, but his eyes followed me around the kitchen with a confused, almost concerned expression. I felt nothing seeing his discomfort. That surprised me because I expected to feel guilty or sad, but there was only a cool detachment, like watching a stranger struggle with a problem that wasn't mine to solve. The weekend brought our first real test of my new approach. Liam's sister was getting married, and we'd been invited to the wedding 3 hours away. I'd spent months looking forward to it, had bought a beautiful emerald dress, and was excited to see his family. The old version of me would have been chattering nervously in the car, adjusting my makeup, asking if I looked okay. Instead, I sat quietly looking out the window while Liam drove. He tried to make conversation, asking about my week at work, and I gave one-sentence summaries. He mentioned the wedding would be emotional, and I agreed with a non-committal hum. By the time we arrived at the venue, he looked unsettled in a way I'd never seen before. The ceremony was beautiful. His sister, Natalie, looked radiant in vintage lace, and her vows made everyone in the church tear up. Everyone except me. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, face neutral, watching like I was viewing a painting in a museum. Liam kept glancing at me, and at one point he reached for my hand. I let him hold it, but didn't squeeze back or stroke his thumb the way I normally would have. When the bride and groom kissed and everyone cheered, I clapped politely without the beaming smile that usually took over my face at weddings. Liam leaned close and whispered, asking if I was okay, and I nodded once. His jaw clenched, but he turned back to watch his sister walk down the aisle. At the reception, I maintained the same controlled demeanor. I made small talk with his relatives, answering their questions about work and our life together with pleasant but vague responses. When his aunt asked when we'd be getting married, I said we hadn't set a date and changed the subject. When his cousin tried to pull me onto the dance floor, I declined politely, saying I preferred to watch. Liam danced with Natalie and his mother and several relatives, and I sat at our table sipping water. He kept looking back at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between frustration and worry. I looked at my phone and scrolled through messages from Kendra, who was asking how the wedding was going. On the drive home, Liam finally addressed it directly. He said I'd seemed off all day, like I wasn't really present. I asked what he meant, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He said I didn't cry during the ceremony or dance at the reception or seem happy for his sister. I told him I was happy for Natalie and hoped she had a wonderful marriage. He said it didn't seem like it, that I'd acted like I was at a business conference instead of a family wedding. I said I thought I'd been perfectly appropriate and asked if I'd done something wrong. He opened his mouth and closed it, unable to articulate exactly what bothered him, because technically I'd been polite and present. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and I felt the first flicker of satisfaction at his obvious confusion. The week after the wedding, Liam started actively trying to provoke emotional reactions from me. He'd tell elaborate stories about his day, watching my face for signs of interest or amusement. I'd listen and respond with generic comments like, "That's nice," or "Sounds frustrating," without any real inflection. He'd show me funny videos that used to make me laugh until I couldn't breathe, and I'd smile slightly and say it was amusing. He bought my favorite dessert from the bakery across town, and I thanked him and ate it without the usual moans of appreciation or enthusiastic praise. Each attempt fell flat against my carefully maintained neutrality, and I could see his frustration building. One evening, he came home with flowers, something he hadn't done in over a year. Red roses, my favorite, in a crystal vase. The old me would have thrown my arms around him and kissed him and put them in the perfect spot where light would hit them just right. Instead, I said thank you, put them on the kitchen counter, and went back to answering emails on my laptop. He stood there holding the vase like he didn't know what to do with his hands. He said he thought I'd be happy, and I said the flowers were lovely. He said I didn't seem happy, and I asked what he wanted me to do. He couldn't answer that, couldn't explain what specific reaction he was expecting, so he just put the vase down and left the room. Kendra noticed the change in me during our Thursday coffee date. She said I seemed calmer, but also somehow emptier, like I was running on autopilot. I told her about my decision to stop sharing emotions with Liam to give him the non-sensitive girlfriend he'd demanded. She looked worried and asked if I was okay. Really okay, not just performing okay. I thought about it and realized I actually was okay, better than okay in some ways. Without the constant criticism and eye-rolling, without needing to defend my right to feel things, I had mental energy for other parts of my life. My work was thriving, I'd started painting again after years away from it, and I'd joined a book club where I could discuss stories without judgment. Liam had wanted me less sensitive, and in removing myself from his emotional reach, I'd found unexpected peace. Francine pulled me into her office on Friday afternoon with news about a major campaign opportunity. The agency had landed a national account for a mental health awareness initiative, and she wanted me to lead the creative team. It was the kind of career-defining project I'd dreamed about since joining the company, the kind of thing that would have sent old me running to Liam, bursting with excitement and plans and nervous energy. Instead, I thanked Francine professionally, told her I was honored, and went back to my desk to start preliminary research. When I got home, Liam asked about my day, and I said it was productive. He pushed, asking what made it productive, and I said I got assigned to a new project. He waited for me to elaborate, and when I didn't, he asked what kind of project. I gave him a one-sentence summary and started making dinner. That night, Liam tried a different approach. He suggested we watch one of our favorite shows together, a comedy we used to quote constantly. I agreed and sat on the opposite end of the couch instead of curled up against him. During the episode, he'd laugh at familiar jokes and glance over at me, waiting for me to laugh too or repeat our inside jokes about certain scenes. I watched with a slight smile, but didn't react beyond that. Halfway through, he paused the show and asked what was wrong. I said nothing was wrong. He said I'd been acting weird for weeks, and I asked him to define weird. He struggled to put it into words, finally saying I just wasn't myself anymore. I told him I was exactly myself, just the less sensitive version he'd requested. His face went pale, and he stared at me like he'd never seen me before. The conversation that followed was circular and frustrating for him. He said he hadn't meant for me to become a robot, and I said I wasn't a robot, I was just controlled. He said I'd taken his words too literally, and I said he'd been very clear about wanting me to stop being so sensitive. He said there was a difference between being less dramatic and becoming emotionless, and I said I was simply giving him what he asked for. He raised his voice saying this wasn't what he wanted, and I responded in the same level tone that I was confused because this was exactly what he'd described. He stood up and paced the living room, running his hands through his hair with visible agitation. I sat calmly on the couch, watching him spiral, and felt nothing. After that night, Liam became almost obsessive about trying to crack my emotional armor. He'd bring up topics designed to trigger reactions, mentioning news stories about injustices or playing songs that used to make me cry. I'd acknowledge the topics with measured responses, agreeing that yes, certain situations were unfortunate, or yes, the music was beautiful. He'd share personal memories from our early relationship, describing how I'd reacted to things with so much feeling, and I'd nod along like he was talking about someone else. In a way, he was. That version of me had trusted him with her heart, and he'd criticized every beat of it, until she'd sealed it away somewhere he couldn't reach. Work became my emotional outlet. Francine and I spent hours developing concepts for the mental health campaign, and I poured all my passion into creating messages that would help people feel seen and understood. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was crafting content about emotional wellness, while my own relationship was emotionally bankrupt, but the work felt meaningful in a way nothing had in months. I interviewed people about their mental health journeys, and I'd cry during their stories, genuinely moved by their courage. Then I'd drive home, wipe my face, and walk into the apartment with neutral composure. Liam never saw the tears or heard about the interviews or knew about the parts of my day that still made me feel deeply. One Saturday morning, I was painting in our spare bedroom that doubled as my office. I'd started a series of abstract pieces using colors that reflected different emotions, bold reds and deep blues and chaotic blacks. Liam walked in with coffee and stood watching me work. He said he didn't know I was painting again, and I said I'd started a few weeks ago. He asked why I hadn't mentioned it, and I said he hadn't asked. He set the coffee down and said we needed to talk about what was happening between us. I put down my brush and turned to face him, waiting. He said he felt like he was living with a stranger, and I said I was still the same person. He said that wasn't true, that I'd become cold and distant and unreachable. I asked if he preferred when I was emotional, and he said yes, surprisingly. He said he missed the version of me who felt everything so intensely. I felt something stir then. Not emotion, but a kind of cold clarity. I asked him to explain why he'd spent months criticizing that version of me if he missed her so much. He said he'd been stressed and took it out on me unfairly. I asked why he'd threatened to leave if I didn't stop being sensitive. He said he'd been frustrated and didn't mean it the way it came out. I asked if he understood that you couldn't demand someone change their fundamental nature and then complain when they actually do it. He stood there in my painting space, surrounded by colors he'd never see me create, and his eyes filled with tears. He said he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that he wanted to fix this. I told him I wasn't sure there was anything to fix, that maybe this was just who we were now. The weeks that followed were tense in a different way than before. Liam tried desperately to re-engage me emotionally, and I maintained my boundaries with unwavering consistency. He'd apologize for past criticism, and I'd accept his apology without offering forgiveness. He'd tell me he loved me, and I'd say okay. He'd try to plan dates or activities, and I'd go along with them but remain detached throughout. It was like watching someone try to restart a car that had run out of gas, turning the key over and over while the engine refused to catch. Part of me felt bad seeing him suffer, but a larger part remembered every time he'd rolled his eyes at my tears or sighed at my excitement or made me feel broken for having feelings. Kendra suggested I consider whether I wanted to stay in the relationship at all. We were having dinner at her apartment, and she'd made her famous pasta while I told her about Liam's recent attempts at reconciliation. She said it sounded like I'd emotionally divorced him already, that I was just going through the motions of cohabitation. I admitted she might be right, but said I wasn't sure what I wanted. The relationship felt dead, but the idea of officially ending it felt overwhelming. I'd invested 3 years, planned a future, imagined growing old with this person. Letting go of that meant accepting I'd been wrong about him, about us, about everything I thought we were building together. 2 months into my emotional shutdown, something happened at work that would have normally destroyed me. The mental health campaign I'd been leading got killed by the client after they saw our initial concepts. They said our approach was too raw, too honest, that they wanted something more aspirational and less focused on struggle. Francine was furious, I was devastated, and the entire team had worked overtime for nothing. I sat in the conference room after the call ended, staring at my laptop screen, feeling the familiar pressure of tears building. But I was at work, surrounded by colleagues, and I'd learned to compartmentalize so effectively that even genuine grief couldn't break through in the wrong environment. I drove home that evening with tears streaming down my face, finally letting the disappointment release. By the time I parked in our building's garage, I'd cried myself empty and could walk into the apartment with my usual neutral expression. Liam was cooking dinner, something he'd been doing more often in his attempts to be a better partner. He asked about my day, and I said the campaign got canceled. He stopped stirring the sauce and turned to look at me, concern flooding his face. He asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine. He came closer and said I didn't have to pretend with him, that he wanted me to feel comfortable sharing. I looked at him directly and said I wasn't pretending. I was fine, and asked when dinner would be ready. His face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before. Not angry or frustrated, but genuinely hurt and scared. He said he knew I wasn't fine, that a project I'd cared about had just been killed, and any normal person would be upset. I told him I'd already processed it and didn't need to discuss it further. He asked where I'd processed it, when, and I said in the car on the way home. He asked why I couldn't process it with him, and I said because he wasn't a safe person to process emotions with. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, visible and impossible to ignore. He stepped back like I'd slapped him, and his eyes went glassy with unshed tears. He said that wasn't fair, that he'd been trying so hard to change. I said 3 months of trying didn't erase 2 years of criticism. That night, Liam slept on the couch. I heard him out there around 2 a.m, the sound of quiet crying seeping under the bedroom door. The old me would have gone to comfort him, would have put aside my own hurt to soothe his. This version of me stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of our dying relationship pressing down like a heavy blanket. I thought about what Kendra had said, about emotional divorce, and realized she was absolutely right. I'd already left him in every way that mattered, We were just still living in the same physical space, two people orbiting each other without ever really connecting. The next morning, Liam looked exhausted, his eyes red and swollen. He'd made coffee and breakfast, setting out my favorite mug and making eggs exactly how I liked them. I thanked him and ate in silence, checking emails on my phone. He watched me with this desperate intensity, like he was memorizing my face or trying to see through my skull into my thoughts. Finally, he said we couldn't keep living like this. I agreed. He said something had to change or the relationship was over. I said he was probably right. He asked if I even cared anymore, and I said I wasn't sure. The honesty seemed to hit him harder than any lie would have. He asked when I'd stopped caring, and I said probably the night he told me to stop being sensitive or he'd leave. He made a sound like all the air had been punched from his lungs. We spent the weekend in careful avoidance, him in the living room and me in the spare bedroom painting. I'd started a new piece, all sharp angles and cold blues, representing the distance between two people in the same space. My phone buzzed with texts from Kendra asking how I was doing, and I told her Liam and I were probably ending things. She offered to come over, but I said I needed time to figure out what I wanted. The truth was, I already knew what I wanted. I wanted to feel safe expressing emotions again. I wanted someone who didn't treat my feelings like inconveniences. I wanted the version of myself who'd existed before I'd learned to shut down for self-preservation. But I didn't know if I could find her again, or if she was permanently lost. Monday morning, I woke up to find Liam already gone for work with a note on the kitchen counter. He'd written that he understood he'd broken something between us, that he'd taken the person he loved and made her afraid to be herself, and that he didn't know how to fix it, but wanted to try. He'd written that he was moving out for a while to give me space to figure out what I wanted, that he'd stay with a friend, and we could talk when I was ready. The note ended with an apology and the words, "I miss you," in handwriting that looked shakier than usual. I read it 3 times, waiting for emotions to surface, and felt only a distant sadness, like mourning someone who'd died years ago. That evening, I came home to an apartment with half the furniture gone. Liam had taken his things efficiently, leaving spaces where his bookshelf had been, where his desk had stood, where his shoes usually piled by the door. The emptiness felt both freeing and suffocating. I walked through the rooms, touching the bare spots, and finally, alone in the space we'd shared, I let myself feel. I sat on the floor of our bedroom and cried for the relationship we'd had at the beginning, for the person I'd been before I learned to hide, for the future we'd planned that would never happen. I cried until my head pounded and my eyes swelled and my throat was raw. Then I called Kendra, and she came over with wine and takeout and let me talk for 3 hours straight. Over the following weeks, I slowly came back to life. Without Liam's critical presence, I stopped monitoring my reactions and let myself feel freely again. I cried during movies, laughed loudly at jokes, got excited about small things like good coffee or sunny weather. At work, Francine noticed the change and commented that I seemed more like my old self. I told her I was working through some personal stuff, and she shared that she'd gone through a similar experience with an ex who'd constantly criticized her intensity. She said some people were intimidated by those who felt deeply, and it said more about them than about us. Her words landed with unexpected comfort. Liam texted occasionally, asking how I was doing and if I'd thought about what I wanted. I'd respond briefly that I was fine and still processing. After a month, he asked if we could meet for coffee to talk. I agreed, curious about what he wanted to say and knowing I needed closure regardless of the outcome. We met at a neutral cafe downtown on a Saturday afternoon. He looked thinner, tired, with circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. He thanked me for coming and said he'd been doing a lot of thinking and even started therapy to work on his issues with emotional expression and criticism. He said his therapist had helped him understand that he'd been projecting his own discomfort with feelings onto me. I listened without interrupting while he explained that his father had raised him to view emotions as weakness, that showing feelings had been mocked and punished throughout his childhood. He said he'd thought he'd moved past that, but realized when things got stressful in our relationship, he'd fallen back on his father's voice telling him emotions were inconvenient and embarrassing. He apologized for making me feel like my natural expressiveness was a flaw instead of recognizing it as the beautiful quality he'd originally fallen in love with. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, but he wanted me to know he was working on himself, and regretted every time he'd made me feel bad for feeling. When he finished, I took a breath and shared my own truth. I told him that while I appreciated his apology and his work in therapy, I didn't trust him anymore. I explained that he'd trained me to hide myself from him, and even though he regretted it now, the damage was done. I said I'd spent 2 months rediscovering who I was without his criticism, and I liked that person too much to risk losing her again. I said I needed a partner who celebrated my emotional nature from the beginning, not someone who had to relearn how to accept it after breaking it. His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly, accepting my decision even as it clearly hurt him. We talked for another hour about logistics, dividing belongings, handling our lease. The conversation was sad but civil. Two people who'd loved each other, acknowledging that love wasn't always enough to overcome fundamental incompatibility. When we hugged goodbye outside the cafe, I felt genuine affection for him, but also relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to monitor my reactions or suppress my joy or hide my tears. Relief that I could be fully myself, without fear of eye rolls or sighs or lectures about sensitivity. Relief that I was choosing myself for the first time in years. 3 months after Liam moved out, I went on my first date with someone new. His name was Oliver, and we'd met at a gallery opening for local artists where one of my paintings was displayed. He'd stood in front of my piece for 15 minutes, studying the way I'd layered colors to represent emotional complexity. When he'd approached me, he'd asked about my process with genuine curiosity and understanding. On our first date, I cried during a particularly moving scene in the play we attended, and instead of looking embarrassed, Oliver squeezed my hand and passed me tissues without judgment. Walking home, I laughed loudly at his story about his disastrous attempt at making sourdough, and he grinned and said my laugh was contagious. I felt something unfurl in my chest, something that had been locked tight for so long I'd forgotten it existed. 6 months later, I got promoted to senior creative director at the agency, leading the team I'd once been junior on. Francine said my emotional intelligence made me exceptional at understanding clients and connecting with audiences, that my sensitivity was an asset that made my work resonate. I thought about Liam sometimes, wondering if he'd really changed or if his next girlfriend would eventually hear the same criticism I had. But mostly I thought about how close I'd come to believing him, to accepting that my emotions were flaws that needed fixing instead of gifts that needed honoring. I thought about the version of myself who'd shut down completely, and while I didn't regret protecting myself that way, I was grateful to have found my way back. The mental health campaign eventually came back to life with a different client who loved our raw, honest approach. The night we launched, I stood in Times Square watching our billboards light up with messages about emotional authenticity and the courage it takes to feel deeply. My phone buzzed with a text from Oliver saying he was proud of me, and I felt my eyes well up with happy tears right there on the crowded street. A woman next to me noticed and asked if I was okay. I laughed through the tears and said I was better than okay. I was finally myself again. She smiled and said that was something worth crying about, and I agreed completely.